Hi, Amrita. Welcome to Network Capital. In this podcast, we try and explore mental models and career principles. We're really excited to be having a conversation with you because you've had a particularly multidimensional, multimodal career. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and what do you do today?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Utkarsh, for having me on the podcast. I've been a member of Network Capital for many years now, and it's a pleasure to be here in conversation with you. I'm Amrita Mahale. I am the product and strategy lead at Vadvani AI. Vadvani AI is a non-profit applied research institute working on developing artificial intelligence solutions for social good. At Vadvani AI, I lead product development in maternal and child health. And as you pointed out, I've had a very zigzag professional journey prior to Vadvani AI. I'm an aerospace engineer. I studied aerospace engineering at IIT Bombay, after which I went into consulting. I worked at the Boston Consulting Group for a little over a year, where I focused on telecom and industrial goods. After BCG, I decided to go to Stanford for grad school, where I decided to study aerospace engineering again. And after a graduate degree in Aeroastro, as it was called at Stanford, I joined Google. I actually graduated in the middle of the recession, and it was only the large tech companies that were hiring back then. So I joined Google's internal consulting team. It was called Global Sales Strategy and Operations. And my team helped Google's business execs make decisions such as which are the new markets to go after, both in terms of geographies as well as advertising segments. I spent about 2 years at Google, including a couple of months in Google's Paris office, after which I went into mobile gaming and I worked at Pocket Gems, which was a Sequoia funded mobile gaming startup.
Right.
I headed user acquisition there for a few years, after which I decided to move back to India, and I've been back in India for 5 years. I did mobile gaming in India for a few years. Then I worked at Goodart and Nicobar doing e-commerce, and then I decided to quit and write full time. I'm the author of the novel Milk Teeth, which came out about a year and a half ago. And it took me a total of 4 years to write the book, about 2.5 years of full time writing. And after the book was out, I joined Vadvani AI. And it's been 2 years at Vadvani AI now.
Connect the dots for me, please.
Connect the dots. Yeah, that's that's hard even for me. So I've always had two sides to my personality. I've always been interested in both the arts and the sciences. And I think in India, if you're good at math and science, there is this invisible hand steering you towards engineering. So I let that happen to me to some extent. I was good at math and science. I really enjoyed studying engineering, but there was also always this writerly instinct. So this tendency to spend a lot of time analyzing and dissecting the world around me, which I think is something that a lot of writers have in common. This deep curiosity about the world, this desire to describe the world, understand the world, which is also something that drives scientists. So I don't think those two impulses are at odds. As for my career choices, I have never been a careerist. So my approach to planning my professional journey was never this is the path, this is the ladder, this is the perfect resume, this is what I'm working towards. I have
Right.
always been driven by an internal compass. So I've been driven by personal goals, and I have tried to focus on learning and development over trying to chart, like a pre-decided journey.
Yeah, that's a really interesting mental model, the compass. Um, Talk to me about some inner debates that you had with yourself while you were doing well in school, doing really well in the corporate sector. What were some conversations that made you explore more? or made you realize that maybe writing is something that you can also do?
Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about my jobs first. So when I was at BCG, there were some things I really liked about consulting. I liked the problem solving. I liked the exposure to new problems, new industries. But there was something about it that also felt a little, I don't know if superficial is the right word, but it was always very external to the real action. So I knew that I wanted to work in a company and take on multiple challenges within a company, which is why I moved from BCG to Google's internal strategy team. And also, one of my first projects at BCG was in the technology practice. It
Yep.
was what was then called the Next Billion project. So
Mm-hmm.
BCG was doing this across multiple verticals, and the vertical that I was working on was mobile phones. And this was back in 2006, 2007. So the question we were really asking was, where are the next 1 billion mobile users going to come from? And how is mobile technology going to transform their lives?
Hmm.
So I realized that I was very interested in consumer technology and how technology impacted the lives of everyday people. So then I decided to work at Google in Google's internal strategy team. So I really enjoyed my time at Google, and that's when I really discovered how important it was for me to uh, work with smart people, motivated people, and a very diverse set of people as well. So that's something that I have sought out in subsequent professional moves too. And again, I like Google, but I realized that I wanted to actually work in a more operational role and
Right.
be more hands-on. So then I decided to take on a user acquisition role in mobile gaming,
Hmm.
which was great. I was the first person on the user acquisition team, and over 2 years I was the head of the team. I was leading a team of 8 to 10 people. We had a marketing budget of $25 million. Um, did some great work, great experiments, but I also slowly realized that it was important for me to work on products that I was proud of. I was not a gamer myself.
Hmm.
Uh, and then I decided to go to Good Earth, where I was doing something similar. It was digital marketing, customer analytics, just analytics in general. But here were really, really beautiful products from our heritage. And at Good Earth, I got to learn a lot about India's craft heritage, textiles. So that was absolutely wonderful. What
And there's
actually
also a
made
master's in between, right? A very
Yes, there
technical
was a
master's. So, what
master's
was the
in
thought
between.
process there?
Yeah, so I think that was something that was not really driven by. It was driven by practical considerations. So I had applied for a master's when I was still an undergrad,
Hmm.
and I had a full fellowship. So it was a scholarship that also came with a stipend,
Hmm.
and that was tied to my department, which was aerospace. So by the time I decided to go to Stanford, I think I knew that I did not want to pursue a career in aerospace, but I did want to broaden my horizons. I wanted to study further. And IIT actually is quite unique compared to a lot of other engineering colleges in India because there is a thriving humanities department there. Uh, but I wanted more of that. So I wanted a more well-rounded education. And I had offers to go to other universities in the US as well, but these were more technology focused. I picked Stanford because it was a university, and it gave me the option of taking classes, of studying across departments. So yeah, so going to Stanford was very much driven by a desire to learn, to develop further. But the choice of department was, I mean, that was decided for me really.
What's interesting is that you're very conscious that you're going for breadth as well as depth to some extent, and not the other
Yeah,
way around. That's a very interesting fact for our listeners to keep in mind. That's also a way to think about some programs where you decide how you want to structure it rather than the program deciding it for you.
Yeah, and even when I was at Stanford, I took classes across multiple departments. I took a lot of classes in the design school, and I think I was very close to being able to graduate with a minor in human-centered design. And like you said, I'm someone who values breadth over depth, and
Right.
this reflects in a lot of the choices I've made in the
Yeah.
past 10, 15 years.
Sure. Let's talk about money a little bit, shall we?
Yeah. Yes, of course.
When you move from top-notch consulting job to a top-notch company, a corporate, and then a high-growth startup, which I assume would be well-paying, then doing other things which perhaps have a different career trajectory. What were some dilemmas you had, and how eager or not so eager were you to jump in?
Yeah. So one of the things about myself that I'm not very proud of is that I'm fairly risk averse. And I think I knew I wanted to write very early on in life, and I think even when I was in IIT, I did want to. I mean, it was very obvious to me that writing was inevitable, but I was very afraid of what making the arts your profession might mean financially. So I put it off for as long as I could. And I started with baby steps. So when I was living in San Francisco, I first started writing on weekends. I took a writing class or two. I wrote a couple of short stories first. And then there came a point when I realized that it was harder not to write than to take on some of the risks associated with writing full time, and that's when I decided to take the plunge. And there were a couple of dilemmas even then. I mean, I was fairly young when I quit my job to write full time. I think I was 30 or 31. But still, there is this mental model that you have that you need 10,000 hours of practice to get good at
Right.
something. So
Deliberate
some of the
practice,
questions
yeah.
of deliberate practice. So some of the questions that were on my mind, apart from just the financial risk, were am I starting too late? And I had not ever faced real failure or real rejection before.
Right.
So there was this real fear of falling flat on my face, of starting over relatively late in life and switching from a fairly structured job to a creative, more freewheeling vocation. So that was something I was afraid of.
I see. And how did the idea come to you when you realized that you cannot help but write? How did you decide to focus on, talk to us about the origin of your most recently published work?
Yeah. So it was a very slow process. I think the themes in the novel, some of the characters and scenes, they were in my head for close to a decade before the book came out. So it's a very slow churn, really. And like I said, I started with baby steps. I first wrote the novel as a short story. I was still working full time then. So I initially started out writing 3, 4 hours over a weekend. But I was very, very disciplined about sticking to this practice. You have to look at, I mean, for anybody who wants to explore a creative pursuit, it's very important to take it seriously, to make it uh, to make it a practice, to make it a ritual. So I had it on my calendar. I would say no to anything else that came up around the same time. So I first wrote it as a short story. Then I realized there was a lot more that I wanted to say. So I wrote it as a longer short story. Then it became a novella. And then at one point I decided it had to be a novel, because there was still more that I wanted to explore in there. There was more I wanted to say. And I think I had written about 25,000 words when I realized that this was not something I wanted to do only on weekends. Because as I was writing, I was also teaching myself how to write, right? So I was honing the craft. And And then I decided that this is something I wanted to do every day. I wanted to get better at it. I wanted to write a good book. So I decided to write full time. But
What's
by
the
then,
most
sorry,
sorry, Amrita, please continue.
yeah,
I'll ask this after.
yeah, yeah. I said, but by then, I had planned out my finances. I knew I was, because I had lived and worked in the US for 4 years and I had no student debt. I was financially fairly secure. So that is what underpinned my decision to quit and write full time for a few years. I understand not everybody has that privilege, that luxury.
But you created it for yourself, right? You said that you're not risk averse. You are risk averse
Yeah,
to some extent. So you
absolutely.
created this
Absolutely.
insurance for yourself. You earned it.
Yeah, yeah, and it was a very deliberate choice. It took many years. Maybe if I were a different person, I could have taken the plunge much sooner. But I think I would have written a worse book. So in the end, things worked out.
Yeah, there is a lot of research that actually talks about second careers in writing. So, a lot of distinguished, very famous authors
Mm-hmm.
actually started and for a very long time continued doing their day job, and then ventured into it full time or not in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
I believe Eliot, for example, um,
Mm-hmm.
is an example is one. Tell me, what's the most exciting aspect of being an author or a writer, and what's the most frustrating one?
What's the most exciting part? I think, at least for me, I just love writing. I love creating new worlds. So the experience of writing, even though it's excruciating, it's torturous, uh, you're creating something, right? You're putting something out there in the world. There's nothing quite like it. There's a sense of ownership, a sense of pride, and I get emails and messages from readers all the time about how much they enjoyed my book, how touched they were by my book. So that sense of power you have over your readers is really something else. As for the most frustrating thing about writing, I have a very long list. I could go on for full hours, I think.
Maybe a top
Uh,
two or three.
yeah, it's really hard. I think, especially for someone who's had a more structured analytical vocation, writing is extremely unpredictable and capricious, right? You put in a lot of work, but you don't know what you will get at the end of it. And I'm not talking about a whole book. I'm talking about one session of writing. And sometimes you just have to sit down and not get up till you hit a writing goal. So it's not as straightforward as, okay, if you will put in so much time, this is what you'll get at the end of it. It's really hard, and it doesn't necessarily get any easier. Writing is also very solitary, and this is one of the reasons I decided to go back to full-time work after I finished my novel. You spend a lot of time in your own head, listening to your own voice, which gets to you after some time. So I think I was craving human company again. I wanted to feel connected to the outside world, apply my strengths and skills to solving real problems, big problems. And that's one of the reasons I decided to go back to full time work. And I think the third big frustration is that in India there isn't that much money in writing.
Yeah,
Uh, it's
barely any, right?
barely any, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as a woman especially, my financial independence is very important to me. And more than the financial independence itself, being seen as independent, being perceived as financially independent is also important. So, like I mentioned, I had savings. I knew that I could take a few years off comfortably and support myself. But this is not how the outside world always saw me. So I think I wish I cared a little less about what people thought about me, but how I'm perceived is somewhat important to me, um, especially along some dimensions, right? As a woman, financial independence. Um, so those are some of the reasons why I decided to go back to full time work.
It's really thought provoking. Thanks for your candor. Um, could you give us a flavor of what your book is about and when you started writing that book, how similar or different was the final product from your initial thought?
Yeah. So my novel Misty is set in Bombay slash Mumbai in the 90s. It follows the lives of two childhood friends, Ira and Karthik, who grew up in the same building in Matunga. Matunga is a neighborhood in Bombay. And through their stories and their journeys, it tells the story of a changing middle class and a changing city and a changing country in that period. The novel really is about, it's a coming of age story about young people trying to find their place in a changing world while remaining true to an idea they have of themselves. And the 90s are such a fascinating decade for like social, cultural, economic, political reasons.
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted to explore what happens when societies change rapidly and what does that do to young people. So these are some of the themes in the novel. The novel changed a lot over the 4 years it took me to write it and edit it. I mentioned earlier in our conversation that I had written about 20 or 25,000 words when I decided to start writing full time. The final draft has almost none of those 20,000 words. Because, like I said, I was teaching myself how to write. I was developing an authorial voice. I was honing my craft. And I think writing a novel is a bit like excavating your own mind, your own thoughts. So as I wrote more and more, I began to discover new layers in the story that I was writing, the new layers were much more interesting than what was on the surface. So I had to shed a lot of what was in the earliest parts of the book.
How does one figure out a discipline to write? What's the art and what's the craft and what's the rigor of writing? Talk to me about your 4 years.
Yeah. I remember when I first quit my job, for the first month or two, I hardly managed to write anything because I was used to writing 1, 2 days a week, right? And when I came to my writing desk, I had already thought about what I wanted to write that weekend because I would think about my book on and off throughout the week. But then when I started writing every day, it was very hard for me to get anything done. And I remember thinking, what if I only have enough words in me to write on weekends? What if I just don't have it in me to be a full-time writer? But to be honest, all I was lacking then was discipline, and there is no silver bullet, there is no magic answer. You just have to treat it as a job. Uh, you have to you have to really build the muscle of grit and persistence. And for me, that meant forming a set of rituals. So I would write and I continue to write on weekends. So I write at the same time of the day in the same place. Uh, I turn off the Wi-Fi. I turn off my phone when I write to eliminate distractions to the extent possible. And then I just sit down. I don't get up till I've written whatever my target for the day is. It sounds very mechanical and I mean non-poetic, but I think the making of art itself is involves a lot of rigor, a lot of discipline, and what you get at the end of it is magical. But the process of creating art is not about magic; it's about discipline.
Got it. How did you get your book contract? Do you have any suggestions for aspiring authors?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I was not someone who was accustomed to much failure, to much rejection, and that changed when I tried to get my book published. The standard path that most writers in India and abroad follow is you get an agent first, and the literary agent then pitches your book to multiple publishers. So I sent out my book to I think about 18 or 20 agents, both in India and abroad, and I was rejected by all of them. Some of them had some fairly harsh things to say about the book as well. I realized that I actually made the mistake of sending an unpolished manuscript out. I should have made sure that I'd shown the manuscript to friends and friends and family members who are discerning readers themselves. I didn't do that very well. So then the agent part did not work out for me. I started writing to publishers directly after making a few changes. And I had much better luck with publishers because two publishers read my manuscript and I had offers from both of them.
I see.
Uh, so it did work out. I mean, yes, there was some rejection, there was some failure, but it was short lived. So I was lucky in that sense.
What is the difference or similarity between launching a book and launching a tech product?
It's completely different. I mean, it's very hard to say why some books do well, others don't. Mine was a debut novel, so it came out very quietly. There was no book launch. There was only one review, I think, in the first month or two, and the book came out with no blurbs, no endorsements. But then it's really interesting. The book got picked up by a few book reviewers on Instagram. They're called bookstagrammers. This was something I learned after my book came out. I wasn't aware of bookstagram at all. So some fairly popular and influential book bloggers or bookstagrammers picked up the book, and then the book took a life of its own. Uh, so it was actually social media that really gave the jump start to my book. And then the newspaper reviews, the magazine reviews, the interviews started coming out after that. And about 6, 8 months in, the book made it to the long lists and short lists of a few major literary awards. So then it got a second life. And it originally came back in hardcover and it came out in paperback in December, so about a year after the initial launch. So the book has done very well, uh, thankfully. But I still don't know if I can break it down and tell you this is what worked in its favor, this is how you launch a book. Because I think you can do a lot of, you can try out a lot of marketing techniques, but eventually what really works is word of mouth.
Right.
And if people like a book, they talk about it. Uh, that is what guarantees success. I mean, I'm talking about first-time writers, of course. With more established names, you already have a large base of readers, so they know what to expect from your work, and there's a sense of anticipation and excitement about reading what your favorite writers have come up with next. So I'm talking more about either debut writers or writers who don't really have a large body of work.
What's your most memorable positive comment or feedback that you have from your reader? And if there has been a sharp criticism, we'd love to hear that as well. And how both of these made you feel? Is audience feedback very important for a writer, or a writer largely writes for herself?
Hmm. So the book has actually got a lot of love from readers. I think I get, and especially now in the lockdown, I think I get at least two or three lovely messages every day on Twitter and Instagram. And there are people who've written me 1, 2, 3 page long emails telling me how the book made them feel, and it's really remarkable. Uh, it's so hard for me to now say that this was my favorite comment, but I can give you a sense of some of the wonderful things that have happened.
Yeah,
I spoke it. Yeah, so I spoke at the Kala Ghoda Lit Fest last year, actually earlier this year. Wow, it was just a month and a half ago, but it seems like forever now.
yeah.
And this young woman came up to me and she talked about this scene in my book where a character has a breakup and then she walks around the city to get over her heartbreak. And she said that she'd also come out of a long-term relationship when she read my book. And my book forced her to get out of the house and go on long walks around the city. And basically, she had moved to the city for this relationship. So her relationship with the city was very intertwined with this relationship that had just broken. And my book gave her the strength and the motivation to negotiate her own relationship with the city. which was really lovely. And and this happens all the time. I have heard from readers who are 16, 17, 18, readers who are 75 years old. It's really amazing. As for criticism, I I think as a writer you can't. I mean, you have to grow a thick skin because you get rejected so many times, or there is the potential for rejection at every step, right?
Yeah.
From the agents to the publishers to reviewers to readers. And now every reader is a reviewer because you can put up your opinion on social media on Goodreads. So I don't let criticism get to me really. Uh, though sometimes people actually write scathing reviews and tag you, and I don't know if they expect the writer to respond. So I usually just leave like a very vanilla message saying thank you for the honest review, like appreciate the feedback. But the book has, I mean, a lot of the criticism has been very valid, and it's actually also great, right? It shows that readers engage with have engaged with the book enough to think about what did not work for them.
Yeah.
So that's been good. So nothing heartbreaking, thankfully.
Oh, wonderful.
The
It's
response
so
has been
great to see first
overwhelmingly
time authors
positive.
do well.
Yeah. I've been very lucky in that sense.
Uh, and it has come with a lot of work, discipline, introspection. So, really interesting. At some point, you should do a writing masterclass for Network Capital TV. I think a lot of people would like to learn from your experience once we share this podcast. Um,
Yeah, that
Amrit,
sounds great.
yeah, please, we'd welcome that. Tell me, Amrita, when do you have a career plan now? I've seen you lead some very interesting AI discussions at various policy and tech fora. I have also met you in literary circles talking about your book. Are you enjoying doing both, or do you have a career plan? Uh, what's your mental model for your future?
Yeah, I think I'm very lucky in getting to occupy two very different worlds. I remember reading somewhere that the role of art is to tell you that you're special, and the role of science is to tell you that you're not, that you're part of a pattern, part of a system. So it's very interesting that I get to do both. I think my career plan for now is to continue to do both. I am writing a second book on weekends, and my job keeps me very busy over the week. And for the last month and a half, because I'm working on some COVID response projects, it's kept me very busy on weekends as well. So there hasn't been much writing recently. But
This is
still, on the whole,
Vadvani
I
AI.
think that's right. That's Vadhani AI. So I think on the whole, I enjoy occupying two different worlds. So my plan for now is to continue doing both.
Great. Tell us, give us a flavor of some of the most satisfying projects that you've embarked upon at Vadvani AI. And
Yeah.
why did you join Vadvani AI? It's you could have decided to take your career in various directions. I know you alluded to it earlier during the podcast, but from this particular section, I want the listeners to figure out an efficient way to think about their future, perhaps a mental model, perhaps a framework that you used, or even if it was gut. I'd love to, for you
Yeah.
to share your example.
Yeah. Like I said before, I wanted to apply my strengths and skills towards solving real world problems, towards solving big problems. I'm someone who's always been interested in technology, and when I started looking at jobs after Milstead was done, I was looking at jobs at the Institute of Technology and Development or data because it was potentially like a bridge between what I'm good at and what I wanted to do. And I
Right.
the Vadhani opportunity, and I was really interested because I think this was about 2 years ago, and AI for good was very new, and I did not know much about it. I was very curious about it. This was an area of technology I wanted to learn more about, and the idea of learning something with a view of applying it to real world problems was also very interesting. I think another great thing about my role is that I work with a very diverse. So we build AI solutions, and on any solution we have four kinds of functions coming together. There's AI research, engineering, product, and programs. So I work with AI researchers, engineers. I work with medical doctors, public health professionals. It's actually really exciting. It's almost like a melting pot of people from very, very different backgrounds coming together to solve problems, which means that you also get to hear and learn from many different perspectives. So it was a little bit of all of these.
Got it. Was it hard to get back into the job market after 4 years or 5 years of full-time writing?
It was easier than I thought it would be. And I mean, I suppose we spoke a little bit about risk aversion earlier in the conversation. And I did always know, even when I took a break to write, that given my background, given my resume, it would not be too difficult for me to get back into the job market. Of course, if I had taken 5 years or 10 years off to write instead of just two and a half, it might have been slightly hard.
Right.
Uh, so there was, I suppose it was a calculated risk that I took.
Got it. That makes so much sense, and makes it clear for our listeners to think about it. This is not the only way to go about it, but this is one definitely tangible and practical way to think about your thing. How has COVID impacted your work, and how, as a
Yeah.
writer, are you thinking about it?
So I lead product development for our projects in the health domain, and we had multiple projects going on with data collection and field experiments running in multiple states in India. And as soon as COVID hit, all ground operations came to a halt, and the entire team started working from home. But we decided fairly early on, like even before the lockdown was announced. I think my team started working from home a week or 10 days before the lockdown was officially announced. But even before the lockdown was announced, I think the team unanimously decided that we wanted to help and take on COVID response projects. So for the past month and a half, almost everybody at the organization has been working on different COVID response projects. So the project that I'm working on is a cough analysis technology. We are calling it Cough Against COVID, where it's an exploratory project where we are trying to find signs of COVID in the acoustic signatures of cough. And the idea is it's still exploratory, like I said, but the thinking behind it is as more and more countries enter the community transmission and the epidemic phases of the pandemic, it's crucial to identify positive cases early and break the chain of transmission. But the symptoms of COVID are very non-specific. So, for example, if you look at COVID positive patients, 60, 70, sometimes 90% of them will develop a fever or a cough. But if you look at people who have a fever or a cough, only 1% of them will have coronavirus, right? So it's a very non-specific symptom.
Right.
Uh, so the idea behind our project was, can we look at other signals which would help you narrow down the probability of having COVID just from the symptoms? And there is some anecdotal evidence that suggests that the cough of a COVID patient sounds different. And there have been other research studies that have shown that cough analysis can be used to detect tuberculosis or other respiratory illnesses, especially in children. So we thought, why not try this out? So we are in the data collection phase now, and we are building some of the technical pipelines to start doing the machine learning work as well. But the main focus is data collection.
Understood. And your writing schedule, is it still on?
It's not been on. I mean, I think last weekend was the first weekend since the lockdown when I could take a weekend off and write, which I was very happy about. But I think this is so overwhelming that I'm glad that I'm not writing, because there is if I were writing, there would have been a strong impulse to write about this current moment. And I've
Hmm.
always believed that you need some distance from your feelings, from your subject matter to be able to process it. So I don't think this is the best time to write or to create art. I mean, I'm sure uh, it's it's very different for other artists, but for me, I need some distance to be able to process emotions and experiences. And if I wrote now, I think everything I wrote would be suffused with anxiety and like a sense of the unknown and a fear of the unknown, which I'm not sure really works for the novel that I'm working on.
Well, I can't wait to read it. I have actually read your first novel, and like other readers, I also discovered it through a review. I think it was on one of the Indian blogs, Scroll or something.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
yeah, I think they carried out a very nice review, which I thought was, and I knew you, of course, so it was. That's how I actually stumbled upon the book and thoroughly enjoyed it. I look forward to reading your second book even more, but I'm thoroughly excited by now hosting you for a masterclass because I think this form of writing needs to be explained much more to our community. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation and how excited I am to take it to our larger community. Thank you for your time and keep doing the awesome work that you're doing, Amrita.
and thank you for the thoughtful questions, Utkarsh. It was a pleasure.